Yo, what is going on, everyone? My name is Nick, or The Notorious Fantasy, and in today's video, we're going to be going in-depth into my wide receiver rankings and tiers for week number 9 of the 2022 fantasy football season. But before we could get into things, I would like to ask that if you guys are new to the channel and you do end up enjoying today's video, that you please make sure to hit that subscribe button down below. And while you're down there, whether you are new to the channel or not, please make sure that you do leave a like on today's video. It would help me out a ton. If you do want to follow me on Twitter, please do so at NotoriousFNTSY. And if you have any questions about week number 9, please ask down below in the comment section or join our brand new free Discord linked in the pinned comment and in the video description. So without further ado, let's get into my week number 9 wide receiver rankings and tiers. We begin with tier number 1 at the wide receiver position. All 5 of these players are must-start wide receivers on the week. Now, Justin Jefferson, over his last 2 games, has not put up huge numbers. He's finished outside of the top 12 in both of those games, but it's not like he really screwed your team over. He was wide receiver 17 in week 6 up against the Dolphins. Then he had bye in week 7, and then week 8, he was wide receiver number 22. Currently on the season in half PPR is the wide receiver number 5. The Washington Commanders defense that he's facing this week is not very good at all. And I think we should see Justin Jefferson hop back on the saddle as a top 5 wide receiver on the week. At number 2, we have Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins going up against the Chicago Bears in Chicago. Now, there is a lot of talk about this game potentially having some severe wind, up to 25, 30 mile an hour winds with 50-mile-an-hour gusts. Now, if we get to Sunday and it looks incredibly windy in Chicago, then my opinion on Tyreek Hill will change, because obviously, if it's really windy, it's going to be hard for Tua Tagovailoa to throw the deep ball to Tyreek Hill. I still think he'll have a decent game and end up being a start-worthy wide receiver, but he definitely wouldn't be a guy inside my top 5 if the wind ends up being severe. Right now on the year, Tyreek Hill is the number 2 wide receiver in fantasy football. He's an obvious must-start every week. At number 3, we have Stefon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills going up against the New York Jumbo Jets at MetLife. Back-to-back 3 games in a row inside of the top 10 at the wide receiver position. He is currently the number 1 wide receiver in half PPR. I know a lot of people will be talking about Sauce Gardner versus Stefon Diggs in this spot, and maybe Stefon Diggs has a slightly down game, but at the end of the day, when you have a wide receiver as skilled as Stefon Diggs, it doesn't matter who the fuck is covering him. I am still going to roll him out with confidence. At number 4, we have DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals going up against the Seattle Seahawks at home in Arizona at 4:05 Eastern Standard Time. In both of the games DeAndre Hopkins has played this season, he's been a top 10 wide receiver 10 in week 7 up against the Saints in primetime, last week up against the Vikings. Wide receiver number 2, the Seattle Seahawks defense is very, very bad, though I will note that last time these two teams played, it was an incredibly low-scoring game. This week, though, I do think things will change. The Vegas odds are showing that this should be a higher-scoring game, so I definitely like D-Hop in this spot, and last week he definitely made catch of the year. That one-hand grab was absolutely fucking bananas. At number 5, we have A.J. Brown, who scored not 1, not 2, but 3 touchdowns last week up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. 10 targets, 6 receptions, 156 yards, 3 touchdowns, 37 fantasy points, wide receiver number 1. And this week, he faces the worst defense in the NFL. I know I kind of just shit down the throat of the Seattle Seahawks, but when push comes to shove, the Texans definitely have the worst defense in the league. And the Eagles are favored by 13 plus points in this game. I really think A.J. Brown should have another solid performance. Will he end up scoring 3 touchdowns? Probably not, but I do think he deserves a spot inside of tier number 1 at the wide receiver position. Next up, we move to tier number 2. At number 6, we have Davante Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville. Now, last week, the whole Raiders team shit the bed big time. Davante Adams scored 1 whole fantasy point, 5 targets, 1 reception, 3 receiving yards, 1 rush for -1 yards, wide receiver 98 on the week. But at the end of the day, while things haven't been all sunshine and roses for Davante Adams, he's still a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football. This matchup up against the Jaguars is great, so I do expect a bounce back out of him. At number 7, we have Cooper Kupp. Now, if this was a normal week where Cooper Kupp wasn't banged up, he would probably be inside of tier number 1 and probably would end up being the number 1 wide receiver in my rankings because of how consistent Cooper Kupp is every single game. Every game he has played this year, he has been a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy football, and he's currently the number 3 wide receiver in all of fantasy football. This matchup up against the Buccaneers is not all that concerning to me, but what is very concerning to me is the injury, because I feel like there's a decent chance that he ends up not suiting up on Sunday in this matchup. Now, we did get some good news after the injury because Sean McVay said there was no structural damage to Cooper Kupp. So his ankle injury isn't super severe, but I still feel like I'm not 100% sure that he's going to end up playing. At number 8, we have Titty Boy T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals going up against the Carolina Panthers. Now, last week, entering that game up against the Browns, I thought this was a smash spot for T. Higgins. Jamar Chase is out for the next couple of games at least, and this is a good spot up against the Browns. Ultimately, T. Higgins, at the beginning of the game, things were not looking so good, but in the fourth quarter, in garbage time, Joe Shiesty got the ball to T. Higgins to finish as the wide receiver 24, scoring a touchdown in that spot. I think this week is a get-right game for the Cincinnati Bengals. The Carolina Panthers defense is all right, but ultimately, I think the Cincinnati Bengals offense is going to look much better than they looked last week, and if they don't look much better up against the Panthers, then you got to start worrying, if you're a Bengals fan or if you have these guys in fantasy, that maybe the Bengals need Jamar Chase to succeed. At number 9, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions going up against the Green Bay Packers. Now, to start off the season, this guy was on fucking fire, NBA Jam style, wide receiver 14-3. Then after that, he got banged up and he missed a couple of games, or he missed one game, then he was on bye week, then he comes back against Dallas, scores 1 fantasy point. Last week, he was wide receiver 29 with 10 fantasy points, but I'm not panicking too much about Amon-Ra, because I'm still under the belief that he is one of the better receivers in the NFL, and this Detroit Lions offense is incredibly legit. Now, the Lions defense is complete and utter dog shit, so with that said, while the Packers haven't looked the best this season, the Packers should be able to keep this into becoming a very high-scoring shootout matchup, kind of similar to last week up against the Dolphins. But I think this time, Amon-Ra St. Brown will ball out. And speaking of the Miami Dolphins, to close in tier number 2, my wide receiver number 10, we have Jalen Waddle away, waddle, till the very next day, bump, bada bum. Wide receiver 10 for me last week up against the Detroit Lions. He was wide receiver 3, and on the year, he's currently wide receiver number 4. Now, my same exact worries, the woes, when we talked about Tyreek Hill, are still here for Jalen Waddle because they're on the same team. If this game is incredibly windy, I'm not necessarily sitting Jalen Waddle, but he is going much deeper down the rankings because it is hard to throw in the wind. And based upon what I've seen as a Dolphins fan, I personally don't think Tua is the best quarterback when it does get windy. It's hard to throw the ball in the wind, so we will see on Sunday. Things will adjust by Sunday, but right now I've seen things are looking a little bit more positive, so I'm a little bit more comfortable with Jalen Waddle right now as I'm recording things on Thursday. Next up, we move to tier number 3 at the wide receiver position, headlined by Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But before we break down tier number 3 and the rest of the wide receivers all the way until wide receiver number 30, I would like to give you guys a quick word from our friends and our sponsor of today's video, DraftKings Sportsbook. If you bet $5+ on any sport pregame money line, doesn't have to be the NFL, could be the NBA, the NHL, and you'll receive $200 in free bets if your bet wins. Now, you heard what I said, if your bet wins. So I don't think you want to bet some crazy underdog. Like, you don't want to bet on the Texans tonight on their money line. What you should do is just bet on one of the bigger college football favorites. This week, that would be Oregon, who have a 99.5% implied win probability, and college football favorites are always the most appealing, in my opinion, when you are looking towards guaranteed win odds. So make sure that when you guys place this wager, if you want to guarantee yourself, or almost guarantee yourself, to win the $200 in free bets, please bet on Oregon. Make sure you click on the link down below in the video description, and you have to be a new user to activate this offer. Back on into things. At number 11, we have Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going up against the Rams. Now, despite the fact that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have definitely been a dumpster fire all season long, Tom Brady has really struggled, Mike Evans is still the number 11 wide receiver in all of fantasy football and has had back-to-back games as the wide receiver number 14 up against the Panthers, and last week up against the Baltimore Ravens. In both of those games, he had 10+ targets. Now, I know entering the year, we all thought this LA Rams defense would be this crazy, unstoppable level force. Now, obviously, no defense is unstoppable, but you get what I mean. They'd be one of the better defenses in the NFL. That really hasn't been the case this season. So again, even with Tom Brady being really bad, like, Evans has been just fine. So he should still be considered a top 12, top 14-ish wide receiver every single week. And we have a lot of buys this week, which kind of moves up guys like Mike Evans. At number 12, we have Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints going up against the Baltimore Ravens at home in New Orleans. Now, last week was a big down game for wide receiver Chris Olave, despite the fact that the New Orleans Saints hit the Las Vegas Raiders defense with a backhand like their name was the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Chris Olave was only the wide receiver 48 in that game, but he did still see 7 targets, and even with Andy Dalton, the Red Rifle, under center, Chris Olave has been incredibly efficient. Wide receiver number 19 in half PPR on the year. Prior to week 8, he was wide receiver 13, 17, 16, and 6 in his last 4 spots. I know the Ravens tried to do a bunch in the trade deadline, make some moves. Maybe their defense has improved. It got a little bit more healthy, but at the end of the day, I still believe heavily in Chris Olave. There's really no one for Andy Dalton to throw the fucking ball to outside of Olave and Alvin Kamara, so I think Olave is in for a pretty solid game this week. At number 13, we have DJ Moore, who has moved up the rankings significantly because for the first 6 weeks of the season, starting DJ Moore in your roster was like playing a game of Russian roulette, but instead of there only being one bullet in the gun, everything was a bullet except for one spot. It was brutal. Wide receiver 55, 28, 93, 36, 36, 73. But the last 2 weeks, wide receiver 8 and number 5. This week he gets the Bengals, and we just saw how good Amari Cooper looked up against that defense last week, and PJ Walker is really helping out DJ Moore a ton. I like this spot up against the Bengals. Maybe I'm too much overreacting to the last 2 games, but I really think DJ Moore could get it done here. He did well up against the Buccaneers. Wide receiver 8 in that spot, so I like DJ Moore here this week as my wide receiver 13. At number 14, we have Tyler Lockett in my pocket skirt of the Seattle Seahawks going up against the Arizona Cardinals in Arizona. Now, on the season, Lockett is currently the wide receiver number 15, which is a huge surprise to me because entering into the season, I thought Geno Smith was not good at all, and I thought that was going to impede on the value of both DK Metcalf, who's wide receiver 16, and Tyler Lockett, who's the wide receiver number 14. Now, again, I will continue to talk about this matchup because this matchup does worry me. Last time these two teams went toe-to-toe, I thought this was going to be an incredibly high-scoring match. Think of a Rock'em Sock'em Robots match where there's no defending a Rock'em Sock'em Robots. You just spam the buttons to beat the ever-living shit out of the other team. And the Seahawks defense isn't great. The Cardinals defense isn't great. So on paper, this matchup screams points. You smell that? You can smell it through the screen. Or on podcast, I guess you can't see it. It's not as funny, but you know what I mean. You could smell it through the fucking screen. You can smell that this game reeks of points. Hopefully it is. The sports books, like DraftKings, make sure you use that offer, project this to be a high-scoring game, so I'm going to lean with Vegas, and I think Tyler Lockett is going to have a solid performance. Currently the wide receiver number 15 in half PPR on the year. Speaking of wide receiver 15, my number 15 wide receiver on the week is scary F1 Terry McLaurin of the Commanders going up against the Minnesota Vikings at home in Washington. Back-to-back games inside the top 20 for Terry McLaurin, who's currently the wide receiver 20 on the season. Now with Carson Wentz, things were looking incredibly bleak for Terry McLaurin because Carson Wentz doesn't have that quote-unquote dog inside of him. Carson Wentz never does the thing that Taylor Heineke does, which is the fuck it, Terry McLaurin's out there. Carson Wentz doesn't have the cojones. He doesn't have the balls to heave the ball 100 yards down the field, not really, like 40 yards down the field to a guy that's triple covered. He doesn't have the balls to do that, but Heineke will do that. Sometimes they'll get picked off and the other team runs directly into the end zone, but sometimes McLaurin makes a spectacular grab. Back-to-back games with 8 targets for Terry McLaurin last week up against the Colts defense in Indianapolis. 8 targets, 6 receptions, 113 receiving yards, 1 rush for -7 yards, 14 fantasy points, wide receiver number 20 in half PPR. I know the Vikings have played very well, but the Vikings are a much different team on the road as opposed to at home, and hopefully the Washington Commanders offense can exploit that. Spoiler alert, we are going to be talking about Curtis Samuel a little bit later, who I also like on the week. Next up, we move to DK Metcalf of the Seahawks going up against the Arizona Cardinals, wide receiver 16 last week. Now, I was someone who told everyone and their mother who asked a question to sit down DK Metcalf because everything that I read on the internet was that DK Metcalf injury was incredibly serious and that there is no way that DK Metcalf should be played in fantasy football this week because of the injury. He's going to be a decoy. He's not going to be effective even if he gets targets. But the man gets 10 targets, 6 receptions, 55 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Wide receiver 16 on the week. DK Metcalf was made in a fucking lab. There's no other reason behind it. There is no other way the guy should have played that well unless he's like some type of a superhuman. Someone whipped out the kryptonite and maybe they could stop DK Metcalf. Again, I like the game matchup here. I hope this is a high-scoring game, so we're going to lean with Metcalf and Lockett being top 16 wide receivers. At number 17, we have Tyler, Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals going up against the Carolina Panthers at home in Cincinnati. Now, last week, I was banging the drum aggressively for Boyd, just like I was with Mr. T. Higgins, but obviously, we just talked about it. The Cincinnati Bengals shit the bed big time last week. Though this week, I think Tyler Boyd's in a really good spot. Though this week, I do really believe Boyd is in a good spot. This Panthers team did allow a bunch of points to the Atlanta Falcons last week. We just saw Tyler Boyd also get a garbage time touchdown just like T. Higgins. I'm hoping that the Bengals aren't fucking frauds and they have a good spot here. This ranking almost feels a little too low, in my opinion. At number 18, we got Gabe Davis. Now, I was a big advocate of Gabe Davis last week. I know he reamed a lot of you. Wide receiver 60 last week, 7 targets, 2 receptions, 35 receiving yards. But at the end of the day, when he has these down games, you just have to think in your head that if you run the simulation back again, Gabe Davis might have scored that touchdown that he should have scored. Josh Allen overthrew him. Gabe Davis could get 4 targets and have 4 receptions for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns. Gabe Davis is an incredibly talented player. And maybe you are a believer in Sauce Gardner. If you are, you want to know who Sauce Gardner is not going to be on? Gabe Davis. So maybe, just maybe, Diggs has a bad game and Gabe Davis goes off again. The Bills are favored by 13, 14 points. They have a 30 implied point total on the team. I love this spot for Gabe Davis. Moving now to tier number 4 wide receivers. And this is where we kind of have a little bit of a buffer because these guys I'm still confident in playing, kind of. But once we get past this is where things start to get risque, as they should say, or as they do say. Back to back, 3 games in a row with over 10 targets, 12, 13, and 11. Last week up against the Ravens, 11 targets, 6 receptions, 75 receiving yards, 11 fantasy points, wide receiver number 28. Up against the LA Rams defense. Again, this is not the same Rams defense from the past, but this is also not the same Buccaneers offense from the past where Tom Brady's slinging it all over the yard effortlessly. Now, I'm still comfortable playing Chris Godwin, but I will note that he has not been a top 20 wide receiver once this season. So, I'm still definitely worried. Expert consensus rankings on Fantasy Pros have him as the wide receiver 13, so I'm definitely not as confident as some other experts. But I will note that Brady has started to look better, and the team looks slightly better. I know they lost last week, but maybe these are all positive signs pointing towards a solid end of the season for Chris Godwin. At 20, we have Juju Smith-Schuster, Mr. Corvette of the Kansas City Chiefs. Back-to-back weeks as a top 10 wide receiver 7 in week 6 against the Bills, wide receiver 4 up against the 49ers, over 100 receiving yards in both games, and both of his touchdowns on the year came in each of those games. They were on bye last week. The Titans should be a great matchup for Juju. But while he's done so great recently, I know deep in the back of my mind that we are in for a game where we get the boo-boo Smith-Schuster, the bad Juju Smith-Schuster, where maybe he gets 8 targets but only catches 4 balls and gets like 60 yards, and that's it. They also have McCall Hardman, MVS. They bring in Kadarius Toney. There are a lot of weapons around Juju. We didn't even talk about Travis fucking Kelce, who is basically the number 1 weapon on this team. So while Juju has performed great recently, I'll give him a round of applause. I didn't think he would even be able to do that this year. He's currently the wide receiver 30, so I'm not banging the drum aggressively for Juju, but we have to start moving him up the rankings if he keeps putting up solid numbers, which he's done over the last 2 games. At number 21, we have Jacoby Myers. Now, when Bailey Zappi, the Zappinator, was under center, it seemed like maybe we were going to start to see a potential decline of Jacoby Myers, but with the Mac attack back last week, Jacoby was the wide receiver number 11. The Indianapolis Colts have been not so hot. They go from Matt Ryan to Sam Ehlinger. Typically, Bill Belichick owns young quarterbacks, except for my guy, Tua Tagovailoa. So I think that Jacoby Myers should be in for a potential great showing here up against the Colts. I still rely heavily on him because he just sees so many targets. 13 targets, 9 receptions last week, 60 yards, and a touchdown. Jakobi Meyers has scored 3 touchdowns in the last 4 games. Normally, Jakobi Meyers, if you remember last year, we were like begging to the fantasy lords above. I had to light a fucking vigil to go ahead and have Jakobi Meyers score just 1 touchdown last year. Now he's ripping them off like it's easy. So I like Jakobi Meyers in this spot at number 22. We have Joshua Palmer. It does appear that Keenan Allen is out yet again. Justin Herbert, the pervert, is down bad. Joshua Palmer is his number 1 wide receiver. But the last time we actually saw Joshua Palmer in action, 12 targets, 9 receptions, 57 receiving yards, 10 fantasy points, wide receiver 31. I like this matchup a lot up against a bad Atlanta Falcons defense. And I think Joshua Palmer off the waiver wire could do quite well in this spot. Next up, we move to tier number 5, where again, things are getting more dicey, and then wide receiver tier 6 is where things are starting to really fucking fall off the edge of the earth, and I'm really nervous about them. Wide receiver 23, the Slim Reaper. Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver Devontae Smith going up against the garbage-ass Houston Texans defense tonight. Now, the biggest thing against Devontae Smith is that he has A.J. Brown on his team, and when they're in the red zone, Devontae Smith isn't this elite red zone threat. They have Goddard to throw the ball to, they have Brown to throw the ball to, they can dump the ball off to Sanders, they can hand the ball to Sanders. Jalen Hurts could fucking dip, dive, duck, dodge like he's in dodgeball and run directly into the end zone himself, so there's a lot of competition for Devontae Smith, but the upside is immense. He was the wide receiver number 1 in week 3. He's the wide receiver 32. He's very inconsistent. His highs are the tip top of one of those skyscrapers in Dubai. His ceiling is incredibly low. Wide receiver 133 in week 1, but you just have to like him because of the matchup. He has 420 yards on the season. At number 24, we have Rondale Moore of the Arizona Cardinals going up against the Seahawks. Now, he had a really down game in week 7 up against the Saints, and I kind of counted him out, and I told people to be a little bit more cautious in week 8, and of course, after I say this, the guy has his best performance on the year. 8 targets, 7 receptions, 92 receiving yards, 2 rushes, 12 rushing yards, 1 total touchdown, 20 fantasy points, top 10 wide receiver as wide receiver 7. Now, obviously, DeAndre Hopkins is the big dog in town. He is the alpha, but I do still believe heavily in Rondale Moore, and hopefully this is a higher scoring game so I don't look like an idiot. At number 25, we have Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers, or Dobbs, going up against the Detroit Lions in Detroit. Last week up against the Bills, top 20 wide receiver as wide receiver 19. Alan Lazard's health is up in the air. If Lazard plays, then you move Dobbs down and you move Lazard into this range. If Lazard misses, then I think you can consider putting Dobbs in the same tier as tier number 4 at the wide receiver position. The Lions also have one of those defenses that you could argue are the worst defense in the NFL, so this is a good spot for Dobbs. I just don't know how much I can expect him to be a smash, because even in these positive spots when Lazard is gone, sometimes he just doesn't show up. Next up, we move to tier number 6 to close out today's video with Christian Kirk. Now, to start off the year, it was all sunshine and roses, baby. Wide receiver 19, 7, 14. After that, he's fallen off the edge of the earth. He bounces back in week 7 against the Giants. Then he's wide receiver 53 last week up against a tough Denver Broncos defense. Now, the Jaguars could smack up the Las Vegas Raiders easily in this spot. The issue is they could just do it by dumping the ball off and handing off the ball 1 zillion fucking times in a row to Travis Etienne. So, I hope that Christian Kirk can bounce back here, but I am very nervous, and if you ask me a question, maybe tonight on Thursday Night Football before the games I go live, you might be like, Nick, do I start Christian Kirk or Devin Duvernay? My opinion might shift. I might go towards Devin Duvernay. These guys are all incredibly close. At 27, we have Devin Duvernay, wide receiver 17 last week, without Rashad Master Bateman. Rashad Master Bateman's injury seems pretty serious, like he's going to miss the next couple of games, and it sucks because I was a big fan of Rashad Bateman. Things didn't end up working out this season, but you know, you win some, you lose some. Duvernay looks good in this spot, though he will not be overwhelmingly heavily targeted. If Mark Andrews does miss, then Duvernay goes even higher in my rankings, but not much higher. Like, he'll just move up 1 tier. The Saints defense has definitely gotten a little bit better as of recently. Lamar Jackson has definitely not played that well as of recently as well, but I still think Duvernay is a solid wide receiver option this week. At number 28, we have Michael Pittman, another guy who, yikes. Wide receiver 42 last week, 50 the week before. And again, I just talked about how young quarterbacks struggle immensely against Bill Belichick. Sam Ehlinger might be fucking fried in this matchup. He might get destroyed in this game. So I don't really feel confident in Michael Pittman. 29, we have Adam Thielen of the Vikings going up against the Commanders. Start off the year, things were bad for Thielen, but after that, wide receiver 17, 25, 68, 18, 33. He clearly deserves a ranking inside of the top 30. The Commanders' defense could get fried upon in this game, but we all know deep down that Justin Jefferson is so good that it really does limit the upside of Adam Thielen. To close out today's video, wide receiver number 30, Curtis Samuel of the Washington Commanders going up against the Minnesota Vikings in Washington. So with Curtis Samuel, he's also been one of those guys that's just like a top 32-ish wide receiver every week. He's wide receiver 24 on the year. So you just rank him inside the top 30. I never really see him going off. Maybe he can now with Heineke, but he's been just decent with Heineke, 29 and 35 at the wide receiver position. So I'm not clamoring for Curtis Samuel, but I also think it would be a little disrespectful to rank him outside the top 30. Now we'll just name off a couple additional guys. We got guys like Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Robert Woods, Zay Jones, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, who are kind of in that next rankings of guys. If Keenan Allen plays, obviously, you throw him up the rankings. But at this point, I don't think that's going to end up happening. So thank you guys all so much for watching. If you did end up enjoying today's video, please make sure that you hit that subscribe button down below as well as that like button. It would help me out a ton. If you do want to follow me on Twitter, please do so at NotoriousFNTSY. So let's get on out of here. Hit that outro. Boy. Also, make sure you check out DraftKings. Link in the video description. Boy.